Welcome to For F1's Sake on our new show Poddock Pass, where we invite special guests to take you behind the scenes of Formula 1 and beyond. I think the first question I had, especially after we had the conversation a couple of weeks ago, was how did you first get into motorsport as a whole? I mean, were you of the generation of going karting first of all? Because you said that you started fairly late.
Yeah, well, the original issue for me, as many sports people from Jersey and the Channel Islands, which is where I'm based now and where I was born, is that obviously that big strip of ocean between here and the UK actually meant that you are quite limited with what you can do on island. So something like motor racing is kind of a non-starter, even though we've got actually a good motorsport scene in Jersey with its karting, hill climb history, motocross, all sorts of stuff. It wasn't actually until I went to school in the UK when I was 16 when I actually started doing some karting at weekends and stuff like that. So it was relatively late at 16. That's a good 10 years behind the competition. So for me, it was really a case of trying to play catch up. So I was at school. I even had Saturday morning school. So there'd be a mechanic at, lunchtime there waiting to pick me up. And I'd go do a lot of karting at PF International, which is probably the best track in the UK. But at that level, again, I was just doing club meetings and things like that. And it wasn't really till I finished school that I started doing Formula Ford, and then it kind of went on from there, really.
And so how did you get to the point where, are there scouts at these kart tracks when you go to these club meetings, or is it a case of, they come to you, the track owners, and say, look, we can see the potential in you here. Have you thought about doing Formula Ford?
Well, there's no set way of doing it, but 99% it's the other way around. You actually have to drive everything yourself. So the situation that was quite fortuitous is that I was living in the UK alone at 15, 16 with nothing to do at weekends, but a passion for always going to watch racing. I'd been, arrive and drive karting a few times with my father, but knew I wanted to try it. But, motorsport, as is always the case, people think, oh, that's for someone else to do. I'm not going to get that opportunity. Well, I found myself with the internet for the first time. This was 99, I think. Yeah, 99. First time I had an email address, first time I had the internet, first time I had a laptop. And by pure chance, I was sat there, an Autosport magazine, which was my Bible at the time, for the first time, and I haven't really seen it since, had all of the team bosses and all of their email addresses printed on the back cover for the Formula Vauxhall Junior Championship at the time, which was, I think, British Touring Car Support, Formula Ford, Formula Vauxhall Junior. So you had people like Antonio Pizzoni, Gary Paffett that were winning that at the time. And it had all of the teams and all the team bosses and their email addresses on the back cover. So I'm sat there with nothing to do, an email account and a laptop. So I thought, well, I've got nothing to lose. So I literally emailed everybody basically saying, look, I've never done anything before. I quite like the idea. I've done a bit of karting. I think I'm okay. How does this work? I've got absolutely no experience. Please help. Send. And I think within a day, I had my first reply, which was from a guy called Tim Sugden, who, to cut a very successful career short in 30 seconds, was ex-Works touring car driver, ex-factory Porsche driver, Le Mans superstar, everything, karting, everything he's done. And at the time, he was running a team himself in Formula Vauxhall Junior, and also had a Vauxhall Vectra scholarship, I think, at the time, which was going back some time. But he basically came back to me and said, look, we look after young drivers. I manage young drivers from all levels. How about I meet you and your dad at the Autosport show in January, which, again, didn't even know what it was, had never been before. So we thought, well, yeah, give that a go, see what happens. And it really started from there. So Tim, for the next 15 years, was my personal manager, my racing manager, had done everything with me. He was even an usher at my wedding. And it was literally the first person to reply, lifelong friends, and I owed everything to him, really. So he enabled me so I karted for his team. I I started doing Formula Ford. He had a spare car, so he was running 4 cars at the time in the British Championship, and I would basically go and do the odd test in their spare car. Um, and it all really snowballed from there. But it got to the point where I left school, having done what was A levels at the time. I don't know what they do now. And we thought, well, if we're going to give it a go, let's give it a go properly, and
Yeah.
let's commit to a year, and see what happens. So we opted to do at the time the Junior Formula Ford Championship, which was incredibly strong, like incredibly strong. And again, full grid of 35 cars, Formula 3 support championship at the time, and did it for the first year and finished 4th in the championship. And we're
Wow.
thinking, oh, okay, well, that wasn't that bad. um, and then because of like everything, I kind of didn't really have another plan, if I'm honest. So
Mm.
it came to the end of the year, and I'd actually ran in a 1-car team that Tim ran, and we thought, well, 4th in the first year, we can win this if we do it again, I think. So Tim went from being my team boss to then managing me, in inverted commas, and decided that he wasn't going to run the team anymore. He'd actually put me with a team called Team JLR, which has actually evolved to become United Autosports, owned by Zach Brown and run by Richard Dean. They're running umpteen LMP2, LMP3 cars. But Richard Dean, who runs that, arguably the best team in the country, had this Formula Ford team, which has fantastic history going back. And we did a 4-car team. There was me, Tom Kimber-Smith, Stuart Hall, and Marco Asma all went on to do various things. And Tom won the senior championship, and I came back and I won the junior championship in my second year.
Wow.
So 2 years in, having never had a helmet on my head, I'm junior Formula Ford champion. Thinking, well, now what? And we made the jump to Formula 3. So 3 years in, British Formula 3, yeah.
When you started in Formula Ford in the junior series, were you one of the younger guys in there still, or was you? What was the age gap in that?
I think no. By definition, I think I was probably one of the oldest. So this was 2003. I won the British Championship, so I'd have been 20. Yeah, at the time. So looking back now, the equivalent of Formula 4, not Formula Ford. I think you can start at 15. So the grid's probably 15 to 18 somewhere. So I would have been at the older end, but as I found out all the way through my career, or junior career certainly, that when people have a 10-year head start, it's all about hard work. I don't think I had I had a bit of talent, but I wouldn't have said I was naturally talented. It was more finding myself in a situation that I thought had longevity and wanted to make a career, and thought, well, I'm going to have to outlearn and out hard work everybody. And that, again, thanks to Tim, that was just instilled in me from, I effectively was a blank sheet of paper. I had no experience. I'd just, nod along and do what I was told. And it was just instilled in me, this work ethic of working hard and figuring out a problem and saying yes. And just, if you can't do something, say yes and figure out a way of doing it later.
Yeah. Do you think it's the same now? If someone joined into a motorsport late now, or if you're an older driver coming into a more senior level of racing, do you think they'd still have the good chance against these younger drivers that are coming through now, from like 8 or 9 years old?
Well, the strange thing now is, and it doesn't seem like that long ago, but it is probably it's now coming up to 20 years ago. But when I was going through that process, this was pre-simulator, pre-social media, pre-YouTube, pre-onboard cameras, all of this stuff that are tools to learn quick, pre-online gaming. None of that existed. So actually, if you took a complete rookie that just liked the idea of being a racing driver, I mean, I've done it before. One of my other side things, as I was, for 15 years, was working with young drivers and managing drivers myself. So I'd been through that process and started a company that went to help people like me, that were literally walking into a paddock at a British touring car event with their dad, not knowing anybody. And it scared me, because I'd learned not the hard way, but I'd learned that there are the right people to meet and there are the wrong people to meet, as in all walks of life. And it terrified me that some young kid that was good, had a bit of budget to spend, had a family that had no experience, you could walk into a paddock and you could meet the wrong person that would literally rip you off, destroy any chance of a career, and you'd have your fingers burnt, and that would be it. So I kind of set out to help people through the process that I'd gone through, from literally nothing to teaching them how to drive, teaching them how to go kart, how to build a race weekend, how to look after yourself, how to train, the mental, all of that stuff. And actually, if you took someone now, as long as they've got the will to work, I had someone from Jersey, a guy called Struan Moore, who went on to do Formula 4. He was actually we had him as George Russell's teammate at Lannon Racing in Formula 4 in 2012, 13, I think. And we literally took him from nothing to winning Formula 4 races in 2 years.
How old was he?
Struan would have been 17, 18 at the time. Yeah, so we'd done some karting, but we literally did a year of Ginetta Junior and then into Formula 4. And in his second year of Formula 4, he was out qualifying George Russell on the odd occasion, and he won a race and he was on the podium. So it is depending on, no one's the same, but 90% of it is work ethic, and if they want to do it enough. Because I see a lot, and admittedly this was 5 or 6 years ago, but I see a lot of the case where, now that times have changed, they'll be sat in a debrief and they'll be on their phone and they'll be messaging and they'll be doing the hair. It's like, mobile phones have just become a thing. When I was in Formula 4, you certainly wouldn't have sat in a debrief going on your phone and worrying about what you looked like. You were literally there until midnight going through data, and that was the only thing you were there for. So I think times have changed, but I think you'd be surprised what you could achieve with a complete rookie in a surprisingly short amount of time.
And so are they having to fund that themselves? So these guys that are coming in, like you said, have they got, that's family backing essentially, that's family money that they're using to fund that campaign?
Yeah, so it's funny you ask. So people either very rarely ask the question or aren't prepared to answer it, one of the two. But to be completely honest, 90% of all national motorsport, 90% of the kids and guys there, it's all personal and family money. And that's nothing to be ashamed of. People somehow frown upon it or don't like to admit it or whatever, but there's very few genuine sponsorship deals in certainly national motorsport. British touring cars is a good example of genuine sponsorship. I think the championship's incredible, the racing's great, the drivers have great profile, the TV's coverage is great, but that's where genuine sponsors want to be. Whereas if you're trying to sell Formula Ford round Brands Hatch in the rain in November, it's hard. So a lot of it comes from friends of the family, people with businesses, their old man is owed a favor by someone else, and you kind of cobble together a budget. And at the time, to be completely honest, and admittedly this was 20 years ago, but a year of Formula Ford, we were testing 2 or 3 days a week. We were doing 50 sets of tires a year. We were just doing it properly. Team JLR was an amazing year of my life. It's unforgettable. But the budget for that was £90,000 for the year.
Right. Wow.
And that's basically the bottom of it's not the bottom of the ladder, because there's club level below that, but national level, best drivers around, proper support, proper trucks, proper hospitality, proper teams, all done properly. You're in for £100,000. So it's quite a difficult one to. It's very easy to be put off at that first hurdle, because you think, well, I haven't got £100,000, so that's me out. But actually, it is spread over a year. So you have a lot of drivers that will basically buy a car themselves. So they'll go to Van Diemen or whoever was making the car at the time. And I think off the top of my head, a car was £20,000, maybe something like that. So they'd cobble together the money to physically buy a car, and they'd own it as an asset. So that's one thing. And then you could, it's on various scales. You might have family or friends that know how to mechanic a car, and they're relatively simple cars to mechanic. So you'll get people that run themselves. So you could actually probably do a season for half, for 40, 50 grand. Right. Or you go the other end of the scale where, I'm thinking of drivers that, Lando Norris was a classic example. The year that he did Genetic Junior, He was literally the smallest person I've ever seen behind the wheel of a racing car. He was half the size as he is now, and it was unbelievable. But he was very quick. But he was literally in a car every day of his life, somewhere.
Wow.
And they'd have done.
That's the commitment.
Yeah, exactly. But it's not just the commitment; it's the opportunity, and they started that plan with one objective of whatever it takes, we're doing it, and we're going Formula 1.
Yeah, it's
Whereas,
almost a little bit like the parents living the dream through the children, isn't it?
Exactly, and there's nothing wrong with it. But the funny thing is, if that's what you're trying to achieve, that journey didn't start when he signed for McLaren. That journey and plan that's a 15 to 20 year process. That if everything goes right, it works. And I think that even the pay driver thing comes up quite a bit in Formula 1. And I know we've chatted about it before, but someone like Maldonado, many of your listeners probably can't even remember who he is, but Venezuelan,
so.
Renault, Williams, on his day, very quick, race winner and everything below Formula 1 he ever did. He obviously won a Grand Prix for Williams at Barcelona, but he was notorious for being in the wall quite a lot, but brought lots of money. That was kind of him in a nutshell. But the reality is, on his day, it was unbeatable. They're good, and everyone's good. That's the problem now, is that even the guys that are bringing money are very, very, very talented. And you can have your opinion of the Mazepins and the whoever's of the world, but the reality is, in junior formula, with a tailwind and everything going perfectly, he was quick. And it just shows the jump between everything else in Formula 1 is there are many, many drivers that are very, very good that for some reason the pressure or just the driving style or the environment within teams, the politics that they're probably not used to, all of these different elements add up to just not being able to perform. So, and I think that, coming back to what we were talking about before, is that when I went to Formula 3, that was the first time it hit me. I thought, wow, this is, before it was serious. This has just got another level. So I won the Junior Formula 4 Championship 2003, and then 2004 found myself at High Tech Racing. So that High Tech that's now Formula 2, kind of two owners prior. High Tech had been started by a guy called David Hale. Really, really, really good guy. Really, really clever. I got on with him fantastically well. A lot of respect for David. And he was in a position where, again, how many cars did we have? I think we ran a 4-car team that first year. And I'd gone from being a rookie in Formula 4 to eventually learning how to do it. And then I was back to being a rookie again. And it was just mind-blowing that the cars were, first carbon tub I'd ever driven, sequential gearbox, first car with downforce, first car with a reasonable amount of power. And it just was like, again, I remember sitting there thinking, I've got to do all that over again now. I've got to literally learn from scratch. But at the same time, the competition's got better as well. So my generation of Formula 3, and I should have dug out a timesheet. That year we did some Euro Series races. We did the Marlborough Masters, which is effectively the World Championship at Zandvoort, and then the British Championship. And 2004, 2005, 2006 were the 3 years I did Formula 3. And the competition was Nelson Piquet, Lucas de Grassi, Sebastian Vettel, Nico Rosberg, Robert Kubica, you name it. Like all of that group. Just
some slow guys.
Just the standard competition. So not only have you got to learn from scratch, but now you're against the best drivers in the world.
Yeah. And
that again, whether it was my lack of experience or whatever it was, that made me think, right, well, this just got even more serious. So let's go even further and even harder, and let's try and push to the point. And again, as well, you're seeing very good drivers that were better than me fall by the wayside and not come back for the next year. And suddenly the competition, or the British competition, so to speak, is getting smaller and smaller and smaller as you go on to international. You do Euro Series races and you go on to the world or international stage. The British or people that I'd raced with in Formula Ford and British Formula 3, that group was getting smaller and smaller. So you find yourself very quickly in amongst the serious group of drivers. So I think I said before, the pyramid of motorsport's not like that. It's like that, basically.
Yeah.
And I think I read a stat that there's about 100,000 license holders in the UK, something like that, through the MSA.
Wow.
For all different types of motorsport. I think it's 100 and something thousand. But if you go from national to Formula Ford at the time to British Formula 3, you're down to 10 British drivers on the second,
really
on the third
actually.
ladder of the career. You're down to 10 from 100,000.
I think what's interesting about that is that we've still got 3 drivers now that are in Formula One, the top level basically for racing and motorsport. You'd think there'd be more almost, because it is British motorsport is massive, and it's a thing that really has been carried through heritage.
I mean, British motorsport is something to be cherished and something to be so proud of. I even think, really? I mean, you look back at the history of the sport in general, and you think how much of it, through drivers in junior formula, the teams, where they're based, the personnel, the stories, the designers, the mechanics, the technology, everything you can think of, the circuits, so much of it's in the UK. And that for me personally was a massive part of anything I ever achieved. Was I was very fortunate enough to have experienced it, played a part of it. And now, since life has moved on, one of the things I feel incredibly privileged to be able to say is that I'm a member of the BRDC, so the British Racing Drivers Club, which obviously owns Silverstone. And that's for me was something very personal, from, having had no involvement with the sport, which I was watching from the outside, to now feel that for the rest of my life, I'll be able to say, well, that's something I did and I achieved, and it's a quite a special thing. And I think that when you look at the history of the club and everything that other members have achieved, it really does kind of make you realize how fortunate. I've always said from the beginning that I was fortunate to have achieved anything. Obviously, I had to do it and had to have worked hard, obviously, but you still have to count yourself very lucky to be able to find yourself on a grid in a car somewhere in the world every weekend. And I think that's the thing that a lot of drivers, certainly young drivers, don't get. They go through the motion. They find themselves that they've landed a seat with, whether it's family money or whatever it might be. They start testing in February, get to the first race in April. They blink and it's October. And they think, what happened? What did we achieve? And for 90% of the grid, you didn't achieve anything.
Yeah.
You've spent 150 grand and you didn't really work hard enough. You didn't concentrate enough. You didn't push yourself hard enough. You didn't listen to the driver coaches. You didn't listen to anything. And you've just basically been on a, how much money can I spend in 6 months exercise? And they either are lucky enough to get another go, or that's it. And it's the drivers that, and I could list the George Russells of the world, which I've been lucky enough to sit in a debrief. I've watched him for a year from the other side of the garage, and you could just tell he knew exactly what the plan was. He knew who to ignore. He knew who to listen to. And he had a great family around him, and everyone was committed, and it worked. And that's not by accident.
It's amazing to have that kind of foresight at that age as well. Because I imagine he was fairly young at that point, because he's still pretty young, even though he's in Formula One. Yeah. Because you don't see that as a kid. You don't see the big picture. You focus. It's so difficult as a kid of that age to not just focus on the here and now. To have that foresight and to think, okay, what's the bigger picture? What do I need to do? Who do I need to listen to?
Yeah.
And I suppose teams can pick up on that trait fairly quickly, because I imagine it's quite rare.
It is, but it's the classic saying as, if I knew then what I know now type thing. But it is 100% true, and I'm telling you now, the difference between the Norrises, the Russells, the Hamiltons, you name it, anyone that's been successful, is that at the age of 18, 19, 20, 21, they were thinking well, A, they were being treated like it, but they were thinking and had the mentality of someone 5, 6, 7 years down the line. And
Yeah.
and I think when you can instill that mentality in a young driver in that Formula Ford, Formula 3 era of their, or part of their career, the difference between them and the competition is massive. You know, when they're in Formula 1 and they do it, well, they're all doing it. So it doesn't really stand out. But when you stick someone that's really switched on and is 5 years ahead of the competition, it just is, you know, beyond them. And, you know, it was the same for Raikkonen. You know, I think we said before, the first year I ever went to a racetrack with Tim, when he kind of took me under his wing, he said, "Oh, we're running a Formula Renault this weekend." And it was the new Formula Renault Championship at the time that Raikkonen was doing it. So that would have been year 2000, I think. And he just stood out like a sore thumb. And he was against really, really good drivers, but he had this mentality of, he knew exactly how to manage a race weekend. He knew how to run each session. He knew what he was trying to achieve. It wasn't just going out and testing and driving around as quick as you can and see what time you do. He was always at the top of the timesheet, straight away, first lap, bang. And everyone would chip away and chip away and chip away. He'd be in the pit lane and then people would go quicker. He'd come out and he'd go bang. And everyone would go, oh. And everyone just chased him for a whole year. And he did one season straight into Formula One. And, you know, the rest is history.
Yeah. And he carried that on through the whole career in racing, didn't he? Until these recently stops. I think we'll see him come back at some point.
Oh, he'll be somewhere,
Yeah, it's like Alonso, isn't it? I mean, we mentioned this last time when we spoke to you. They went on that race day where Alonso was there, and you realize how good he is compared to everyone else. And that's the difference in Formula One. But I was going to say, with like World Rallycross and things like that, and he's really dangerous. Well, you perceive him as dangerous now. A lot of people go, "I got to have a bit of a screw loose." Do you think that kind of says to some drivers that I shouldn't be doing this? Do you think ever get scared of what you're doing?
Yeah. I think the honest answer is yes. If they're still racing, they probably won't ever admit it. But there's quite a few occasions where, you know, I'm literally thinking of a few in my head. So, you know, in the rain at Le Mans at night. Strangely,
it must be terrifying.
Spa is a favourite circuit of mine, probably in the top 3. But round there on a grey, wet day, you know, in the middle of the grid when you literally can't see anything. I've been there quite a few times, and you just think, "What the fuck am I doing?" Like, you literally say to yourself, "This is insane. This is not how to pay the rent." You know what I mean? But there are occasions where, certainly in qualifying, where you've really got to just think, right, doesn't matter if the car's capable, if I go off, I don't care if I destroy the car. That quick pole lap, and I can think of, you know, my year in World Series by Renault in 2009 when we were always at the front in qualifying. If you do a really good lap in quali, you don't want to do it again. Like, you literally finish the lap and you think, I really wouldn't want to do that again. And it's quite funny where, depending on what the format of qualifying in whatever championship you're doing, sometimes you have to do Q1, and, you know, and I always think of Formula One now, they effectively have to do probably 3 or 4 of those laps that they probably don't want to do again. But qualifying is one of those things that, if, you know, you breed confidence, you know, if you're not confident, qualifying is a nightmare. It's a nightmare. Whereas actually,
is there automatic traction in cars now? I don't know if that's a thing. You know, in road cars, you'll get the automatic traction control when it's wet and you're starting sliding or something. It will automatically adjust. Do these cars now, when you're going on a wet lap, do they have like an automatic stabilization?
So GT3 cars do. So in GT racing, which is where I effectively ended up as a professional, so to speak.
Yeah.
GT racing is built around the concept of gentlemen drivers being able to take part. And when I say take part, they bring a lot of, you know, you may have a number of ultra high net worth individuals that like to go and play with racing cars at weekends. But the sport is effectively, other than manufacturers that we all know about in GT racing, 90% of the GT teams around the world will have a gentleman driver involved in the business some way, whether he's a team owner, whether he's a car owner, whether he pays, you know, 90% of the budget and 2 pros, or a pro and another kid pay the other 10%. So they need to have cars that can be drivable by the man on the street that can take a car to somewhere and get a bit of practice and be on his way. So so they have traction control, they have ABS, which is, I hate ABS on race cars. I detest it with a passion, almost as much as DRS. But they have to have certain systems to make them drivable, because actually, so the GT2 cars that I first drove for Ferrari in ELMS and World Endurance Championship, they had TC, so they got traction control, which was actually in the Ferrari, was on the 458, was effectively the system from the Formula One car from 10 years previous. So it was an amazing system. You could literally have full lock, first gear coming onto the straight in Spa, and just 100% throttle, and it would just sort itself out. It was incredible. But the stability control and ABS is something that they do have, so the gentleman drivers can survive a lap, basically, and not be embarrassed. Because and the reality is with ABS, if you imagine turn one at Spa, you can send a gentleman driver down there, 60 years old, and he can brake as late as a pro with no technique. He just hits the brake as hard as he can, literally puts his foot through the bulkhead, and the car just goes, stops. And then he turns and he goes 100% throttle.
Turn it down.
You can turn it. The ABS, I think you can control a little bit, but it makes a pro's life quite difficult when you've got people that you're trying to, that, in a normal car would probably be 5, 6, 10 seconds a lap off in some cases. So it does make the racing closer, but it also enables the sport to be more accessible, because as I said, a lot of these teams, if you look at the Spa 24 hours, all those GT3 cars, 90% of those teams will rely on a gentleman driver being able to take part, bringing money, paying the bills, paying the rent, paying the salary, all that sort of stuff. So it's a clever way of being inclusive.
That's where we're aiming to be in 20, 30 years' time, isn't it, Brad?
Yeah. Well, tell you what, though, joking apart, one of the most interesting. So I mentioned Struan Moore, who I looked after in Formula 4. So his father did a bit of racing, Ian, really, really nice guy. And Ian, Struan, myself, another driver, and Tim, my manager, the 5 of us did the Spa 25 hours in a Fun Cup car. Have you seen Fun Cup? Do you know what Fun Cup is? It's basically an old VW Beetle shell on a Formula Ford chassis, is the best way of thinking about it. So if anyone's watching, just Google Fun Cup Spa and you'll see what I mean. And I think there's 120 cars on the grid, something like that. And it's 25 hours of Spa, and I think we finished second. So there's a diesel and a petrol championship, and also, so I think we were second in whatever class. I think the trophy's over there somewhere. And it was one of my favorite tracks. Good fun, great people, really relaxed, great racing. Like the slipstreams was just incredible, and it was genuinely one of the most fun experiences of my life. And I reckon if you had a license and you had $5,000, you could probably go and do it.
Is that it? Wow. Okay.
You could find a seat in a car. Yeah, you could find a seat in a car for $5,000, and it would be the best $5,000 you've ever spent. So even though people say, "Oh, it's too expensive," racing's for it is, but actually,
there's different classes.
There's different ways of going racing. Let's be honest. And my tip to anyone, if they were like me, that was sat at home watching it on TV, I was going to stand on the bank at Thruxton and Silverstone with my dad, being angry whenever I used to leave a track. I must have been a nightmare kind of 12, 13-year-old kid, because I'd literally come away from the track just in the worst mood, thinking, I can't believe people get to do that, and why isn't it me, and like a spoiled child. And my advice is go to races, talk to teams, talk to team managers, find out what's going on, ask stupid questions. Team bosses up and down the paddock in touring cars, Formula 3, Formula 4, anything you can think of, will give you the time of day. They do want people to come into the sport. They're just the same as everyone else, but with a team shirt on and a pass around the neck. They're not this different level of unapproachable people, and just go and find out. And
we need to get Alex to listen to this, because he was kind of like an aspiring person in what he's doing Janetta now. I don't know if you listened to that episode, but he wants to do stuff like that, and we're trying to get him to do a feature of us as well. We can talk about what he wants to do. But as a Greek driver, there's not many Greek drivers that ever really came through the main motorsport channels. So he wants to be the first one that's actually managed to get to Formula One, and he has started late. But I think it's possible because he's got so much passion for the sport.
Yeah, but I think the thing is now, I mean, people talk about Formula One like it's the be all and end all, and your career's failed if you're not a Formula One driver. Well, that's just simply not true. You can make a living within and this is not just racing. This is from working in the industry. The industry itself is, I think our last stat I saw, even the UK alone brings, I think it's over £7 or £8 billion to the British economy every year. It's massive.
Wow.
And the number of jobs within the motorsport industry, from mechanicking to marketing to hospitality to mechanics to you name it, TV, the list is endless. And I think people find their ways through the sport, through the industry in various ways, but in all honesty, it is such a good way to earn a living. So I, my life's changed. I'm back in Jersey now doing different things, but there was a period where for 5 or 6 years, I'd probably be racing, I would be doing ELMS in the Ferrari. That's 5 weekends a year, plus Le Mans is 6. I'd do 2 or 3 other championships, maybe Daytona at the beginning of the year, maybe something in Asia. Every other weekend, I'd be at a racetrack managing a young driver, coaching a young driver. I'd be on the simulator at Worth doing all the stuff for IndyCar, for Honda, 2 days a week. I'd be doing commentary for ESPN on a Monday, commentary for BT Sport on a Wednesday. And so literally 7 or 8 jobs at a time, meeting the best people, traveling the world. And I don't want people to think, oh, well, I have to stick at my day job because I can't race a racing car. Even Formula One, the number of roles within Formula One now are incredible. But just do a bit of research and look at the sport in general, and the industry in general is incredible in terms of earning a living from it.
And so, in terms, so like you said with the ELMS series, so how does that work then? Do they sign you up as a driver, and so you're set then contracted? We do this amount of races per year, so you need to make sure you're at these races, or is it a case of you get a call 3 weeks before saying we need a driver for this weekend, or in 3 weeks' time, can you fill the spot? How does that work?
So it's different for everybody. So I think the key thing to think of is that there's no set rule to it really. So I'd found myself in a situation where I'd gone from Formula 3 to World Series by Renault, which is effectively the same cars as Formula 2, which supported Formula 1 in Monaco, but was a standalone event everywhere else. Challenged for the championship in 2009. Outside of Formula 1, there was effectively myself and Oliver Turvey, who's doing Formula E now, as the next 2 British drivers, and Virgin were coming into Formula 1 in 2010 and wanted a British driver to partner Timo Glock, and approached Ollie and I and said, look, the drive's yours if you've got £6 million. And so you find yourself there thinking, well, okay, so I've raised all this money, done everything I've done for, by this point, 8 years. So 8 years from never having a helmet on my head, I found myself being offered a Formula 1 drive, but you've got to have £6 million. So to be at the back of the grid, being lapped 3 times, didn't really turn us on very much. And ironically, one of the best teammates I've ever had, Lucas Di Grassi, again, Formula E now, who was my teammate in Formula 3, took that drive. And they don't get much better and naturally talented than Lucas. And, he was, again, being lapped, 2 or 3 times the race. So I think at that stage, we decided to do one more year in single-seaters, which was with the Super League formula. So it was a football concept where the cars were sponsored by football teams. But those cars were epic, V12s, 2,000 kilos of downforce, no power steering, sounded epic. But at the end of that year, I then made the jump to sports cars. So the way of thinking it is, the higher up the single-seater ladder you get, when you fall off that ladder, the higher you land, if that makes sense. So I'd basically got to Formula 2, which meant when I fell off the single-seater ladder, I landed in a factory Dunlop Ferrari 458 ELMS team, which was just incredible. So it was called JMW Motorsport. run by a guy called Jim McWhirter from Ireland. And he'd been successful with Aston in the past, and then had made the switch to Ferrari, and we had the new 458 in 2011. I partnered Rob Bell, who I think now I'm going to say he's at McLaren still now, doing GT stuff. But basically, to get my foot in the door there, I brought some money. So it wasn't anywhere close to single-seater money, but I think, being perfectly open, I think we managed to raise about 100 grand, something like that, that basically got me to partner Rob. And Rob at this stage is a seasoned professional in GTs and earning good money. But yeah, I still had to find budget to get my foot in the door. But once you've got your foot in the door, then the hard work really starts. You've got to basically earn your right to be there, which I managed to do. So we actually won the first race at Paul Ricard, beating Bruni and Fisichella. So my first ever GT race. It was quite surreal. I kind of, obviously you share the car, so I came out into the race an hour and a half into the race for my first ever stint in a Ferrari in a GT race, and I had Fisichella 2.5 seconds behind me. And I was like, right,
fuck that.
I've got a real good opportunity to look like an absolute dick now. So keep your head down and just chip away at it. And we ended up winning that first race. We ended up finishing second in the championship in the first year to Bruni and Fisichella.
Wow.
But I was able to show in that first year that I was quick. So we went to Spa, knew the track, didn't know the car, but in the race, caught and passed the other Ferraris, took the lead, all that stuff. Estoril, we won, dominated the race. So there's all these little glimpses of, even though you don't win the championship, you finish second and get an entry for Le Mans, which was key for the team. But what it meant was that the following year, Rob had moved on and I got his seat, effectively. So I bumped up and I was joined by Johnny Cocker, who's a good friend of mine, British GT champion. And then the two of us went on to do the following year. So you kind of work your way through. So you go from bringing money to getting a free drive to getting paid.
Right.
And I think it's a way of, to answer your question, you're effectively self-employed. So everyone outside of Formula One, you get the odd driver that's a factory works driver for Ferrari or Porsche or Aston or whatever. But 90% of the other people that are earning a living from it, that are quick enough to earn a living and reliable enough and hardworking enough, you're effectively self-employed. So you can do a one-off deal for Daytona in January. You could get a full-time ELMS deal. You could do a full-time WEC deal. You could do Asian GT. You can literally fly yourself all around the world all year, doing one-off deals for teams, charging, $5,000 a weekend, whatever you want to get paid, and you cobble together your year, and you fill your diary, and you go racing. But the stressful part of that means you're basically unemployed at the end of every year, and when you go to buy a house, the guy that gives you a mortgage doesn't want to know, and all the usual stuff. But it is an incredibly satisfying way to travel and to meet people and be successful and feel alive. And I've always said, now I've stepped away from it, that it was incredible to physically do it and to find yourself in a car on a grid at Fuji or Spa or Daytona or Le Mans or whatever. But just below that, one of the most satisfying things about the 15 years that I raced was the people, I think. And the people I was lucky enough to have worked with, the engineers, the team managers, the designers, everyone. It really is a very special place to work. And I think I was blown away on occasions by, these guys that have got stories to tell, that have been, so one of my, closest relationships I had with the team boss was a guy called Rolly Vincini, who ran P1 Motorsport that I drove for in 2009 in World Series. And he'd been at Brabham in Formula One. He was Ayrton Senna's, I think at some stage he was Ayrton Senna's gearbox mechanic. He'd worked in Formula One, good friends with Bernie, been through that whole era of Formula One with the PKs and the Patrasis and all sorts of stuff. And having that knowledge and how he would manage a team and how he would manage people and how he managed stress and how he managed when a weekend wasn't going right, and how you get yourself back on track, and if a session's not going quite right, how you react from it, and all that stuff. And it's taught me, outside of motorsport, from having a family to having normal jobs to interacting with people, so many of these, I hate the phrase, but transferable skills have come from these people that I've found myself working with for 10 months of 1 year, 15 years ago,
Yeah.
But like I've said, that you can see drivers with talent. You can also see team members and mechanics that have the same skill. So Richard Dean, who now runs United Autosports, I owe him a huge amount. But I could see even then, 20 years ago, that he would be. It doesn't surprise me one bit that he's successful and running the team that he's running, because he had it in him, and you could see it. And I think and that's the same in Formula One now. You've got there's certain people that just have a way of managing situations. So, I know we talked about the Netflix thing a lot, but now people are seeing more behind the scenes of the sport, whether it's the team managers or the mechanics or the engineers. You can really see the different ways that people manage the whole season or the whole race weekend. So someone like Christian Horner versus Toto Wolff, or Christian Horner versus the guy that was the Renault team boss.
Günther Steiner.
Günther Steiner, classic example.
He's a great example.
You see all these different ways of doing it, and it's just fascinating when you find yourself in the middle of all of that, and it becomes very clear very quickly what is the way to do it. And I've been in situations, as all drivers have been, where there's not a way to do it, and it just falls apart and it just doesn't work. But yeah, I think that series, the thing I take away from it is, the coverage of the racing is okay, but I think the real story that it tells of the personalities of the people and the team managers is really interesting.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a misconception, isn't there? I think a lot of people, especially people that are new to the sport, or new to Formula One at least, I think a lot of our listeners might be, is they think it's it's an easy job. It's these people are privileged to be in the. I mean, there is a certain privilege to be in that position as your daily job, but it's not without its extreme hard work. But then it's also it's not a case of you turn up to the track, you get to drive the car, and you get paid a load of money. It doesn't quite work that way. I think there's quite a big misconception about how motorsport works at grassroots level.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's the thing. I mean, so from the outside, the picture that's painted is completely different. So, for example, the only people that earn a living from single-seater racing are Formula One drivers and some IndyCar drivers. So
really?
every single driver. No. So there's drivers bringing budget to IndyCar in the same way that bringing budget to Formula 2. If you want to go and do Formula 2 for a year, you're doing £2.5 million. It's costing you £2.5 million. There's no prize money. They're not getting paid. It's £2.5 million. And I think, by the time you've done 3 or 4 years of that, plus the 3 years of Formula 3, plus a couple of years of Formula 4, you're £15 million deep before you've even got to the point where you're in a Formula 1 car. So it's if you take that world and compare it to any other sport, it doesn't. The model doesn't work. So if you look at football, and you've also got to look at the numbers. So you've got 20. Say all the Formula 1 drivers were earning good money. So you've got 20 Formula 1 drivers, and say there was 20 IndyCar drivers earning good money. So that's 40 drivers in single seaters in the world. So that's the equivalent of what? 4 football teams, roughly 3 football teams.
Yeah.
Imagine if there was only 3 or 4 football teams worth of professional footballers in the world, not in the country, in the world.
Yeah, entire world.
Whereas actually, when you look how many footballers earn a living from kicking the ball around in the world, it'll be in the tens of thousands. I'd imagine. At a guess. So, teamed with that is that you can go and buy a football and a pair of boots, and you're good to go. practice and
weekend.
practice
Yeah,
until your heart's
exactly.
content. Same with golf. You can go and buy a couple of 7-iron and a putter and a bag of balls at the range, and you're good to go. Whereas if you want to go and practice being a racing driver, well,
It's going to cost you a lot of money.
the cheapest thing in the world is a track day in a road car, and that's £400 or £500 before you've even started. But if you want to, if you're going to think about doing a year of Formula 3 or Formula 2, I remember when we were trying to have to do winter testing and stuff like that to look at Formula 2 or GP2 it was at the time. A test at Jerez in a GP2 car is 30 grand.
30
for a
grand?
day.
Just for a test?
Yeah. And you'll do, because the tyres will fall off a cliff, you'll do an old tyre run, maybe 2 old tyre runs and a new tyre run in the morning and the same in the afternoon. You'll do 25 laps.
Would you ever get to a point where you're like, we'll leave those tyres, I'm done for today? Because you can't.
Well, the thing is, it does become, if you're not careful, I joked about it before, it can become, if you're not clever with it and you're not advised properly and you're not thinking of the bigger picture, it can become a how much money can we spend in a year competition. So for example, one of my biggest regrets is that I never did Macau Formula 3 race ever.
Yeah.
So even though I did 3 years of Formula 3, I wasn't ready for it my first year, being completely honest. I think the best result I'd had in England was a 4th or a 5th, I think. But I just wasn't ready for Macau. It's probably the most difficult street circuit in the world. So instead of spending 25 grand or 30 grand or whatever Macau would have cost, we took a car to Europe in the winter, and Nelson Piquet at the time, randomly, who had links with High Tech, was about to go into GP2. So Piquet and his old man had hired all these circuits, Nürburgring, where else did we go? Hockenheim, Nürburgring, and somewhere else. They'd hired them privately, 50 grand a day, just to hire the track. And basically we said, for a few quid, can we tag along and do some Formula 3 laps? And they said, yeah, knock yourself out. So we basically took the money that we would have spent in Macau, and we went winter testing by ourselves, trailer and a van, bit national racing, but we went to Hockenheim and to Nürburgring, and we threw some tyres at it, and we learnt. I still needed to be better than I was. So
how many people do you bring with you as a team?
So in those days, if you're going to run a Formula 3 car, you could do it with 2 or 3 people. And we'd literally take 3 or 4 sets of tyres, the car, because at the time, my focus was on qualifying, so I wasn't a good qualifier. And those cars, like Formula 1 now, you basically finish where you qualify. Like Formula 2, it's hard to pass. So we went and with an objective of teaching me how to get the most out of a new set of tyres, which sounds obvious, but a large percentage of when you teach someone to drive a racing car is how to maximize new tyre grip. A lot of people actually go slower on new tyres because they overdrive, not quicker. And I think I got more out of that winter testing at the end of 2004 than any other stage in my career, probably. Because it was, when we talk about spending budget and how are you most efficient and don't, think of the longer term, that meant I came back in 2005 where I actually switched to Fortec, a stronger driver. And I had, Mike Conway as a teammate who was on his day better than anyone. So everything was gradually creeping forward, and, going to spend 30 grand at Macau and putting it in the wall and hurting yourself. Oh, well, that's great, but it doesn't do anyone any good. So you've really got to think about what you're trying to achieve, how you best achieve it, and don't be sidetracked by people saying, oh, I'll tell you what you want to do. You want to do this. Well, no, you want me to do that because you're going to earn a few quid out of it. So you've really got to focus. And that's why it's always good having a team of people. So I had Tim that was always like on my shoulder of what to do or not to do. So I think my advice to anybody, again, just have your core team of people that can always look at it from the outside and give you valid opinions based on experience, not just, a bit of guesswork. But yeah, it's it's a strange one to explain, but there's no set way of doing anything. I think answers your question. You can literally, there is a lot more flexibility than you think, but the only restrictions you really have as a driver is once you sign up to compete in championships like Formula 2, Formula 3, you are limited to how much you're allowed to drive on the circuits you're going to race on, if that makes sense. So you can't, if you were going to race at the Hungaroring, there's probably a rule in the championship said you can't go and test there at any point prior to the race. So there are a few limitations, but not masses.
Right. Interesting.
So I was going to say as well, with your, away from that part, with your whole career, we like in Silverstone, we watched George and Guan Yu Zhou first lap, they're out. Did you ever have a point in your career where you were first lap and you're out? How's that affect your weekend, your mentality?
Did I have a first lap and you're out?
You're not going to admit it.
No, I would quite happily admit it. I don't think first lap. However, touch wood, that's the table that I'm sat at. I'm never going to hurt myself in a car. However, I did have my fair few of big shunts that I somehow walked away from. My biggest was actually at Alton Park in Formula 3. I had a slow rear puncture and I had Mike Conway behind me, and he basically put his nose under my rear floor and picked the car up and spun me into the inside wall. I think it's on YouTube somewhere if you type in Formula 3 James Walker Alton Park. And basically the car spun around, so nearly went over the wall into the crowd, which would have been horrific, but basically snapped the car in half. They found half the gearbox down at turn 3. And I did get out and I was like, a bit of a sore neck, but I was okay.
Was that at turn 1 at Alton Park?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen a few.
That happens a lot there.
I've been.
It's a hard track.
To Alton Park for a few F3 races, and it's always that turn 1 that there seems to be the biggest.
It is hard. It is, but it's an incredibly rewarding track when you get it right. But it's challenging. It is really hard.
It's narrow.
Yeah, very narrow. Yeah. So I don't think
we were there last year. Yeah, we were there this year. We watched the GT3 guys going around, and the day after we were there, that same corner, a car went straight through the barriers. Looked pretty bad.
GT3 car. I drove the Mercedes SL. I want to say SLS, SLR in British GT there, which was basically the width of the track. It was like a speedboat. It was like a ferry. That thing. It was crazy. And I've never driven a wider car around a narrow track quite like that.
Ideally, in terms of position, then.
Well, yeah, it would have been great, and then
take up the whole track.
You wouldn't have to worry about it. But in terms of crashes, it's one of those things that at the time, it's very easy to think that your momentum has come to a sudden halt, and that your season doesn't continue as it was, or your weekend doesn't continue. But that's where the experience, the hard work, the professional approach, the good management, that's when it really counts, because there's no assuming the car can be rebuilt, which it 99% of the time can be rebuilt by the following day. You literally just jump back in it and you don't even think about it. It is really hard to explain. You genuinely do not even think that the day before you've nearly killed yourself, and you just carry on.
So, Is there no pressure from the team then? With regards to crashing, do you? Especially when you're stepping up in formulas and you're going from Formula 4 to Formula 4 to Formula 3. Is there any? Obviously, as a kid, for these kids that are now racing in those categories, they're 16, 17 years old. Are they going to feel pressure from the teams? With regards to
the pressure doesn't. Yeah, so in the junior formulas, the pressure doesn't really come from the teams, because the team driver / parent relationship is one of a customer. So actually, as the customer, you're paying for it. You can do what you want with it. But obviously, it makes the team's life easier. Certainly, if they're a successful team and they're trying to win championships and they're trying to keep a reputation, that you're not in the wall every other lap. And obviously, it makes the team. If you're having to rebuild your car after every session, it obviously does take away from potentially how they can focus on teammates. So of course, I'm not saying that it's okay to crash by any means, but you're ultimately responsible for your own weekend or your own career at that stage. Whereas when you get to the point of driving for someone else and getting paid, so for example, at Ferrari or in GTs, your team boss owns that car. It's not yours. You are also paid that weekend to be a professional in the same way that anyone else is paid to go to work. There are certain standards, there's a certain way of behaving, certainly certain ways of communicating. But I did, the only time I've really worried about damaging cars or cost of damage and things like that was actually, there's 3 times. The first time I did Formula 3, so the first year, being completely honest, because it was a big jump in budget from 90 grand to what was a year of British Formula 3 then? 400 grand probably to do British Formula 3. 350 to 400 if you were going to do it properly. And suddenly I was aware of just how quickly I'd got to that point, and my confidence probably wasn't as high as it should have been. It was very easy to feel unconfident, which I had to work on a lot from a sports psychology perspective. The second time, which I didn't necessarily, it didn't stop me from being quick, but it was something that certain key areas of the weekend you have to remember. So World Series by Renault, which was a championship I loved, absolutely loved. But the cars, they were quick. They were probably running. So in Monaco, I think the year I finished on the podium, I think our fastest lap was probably 5-6 seconds off the back of Formula 1, maybe. So within 5 seconds of the back of the F1 grid round Monaco. So not slow by any means. But those cars were quite challenging to race because the visibility of the front wing and the front of the car wasn't great. And I remember the first time I went to Monza, down into turn 1 at Monza, big braking area, down into the first chicane. And all you had to do was literally, if you were behind someone, just literally touch the rear floor. And the way the floor was shaped and the way the nose sat, it basically did your whole front wing and your nose box in one hit. And that was it. That was weekend over, basically. And I remember, I think it was a teammate of mine, did exactly that. Just gave someone a bit of one of them into the chicane because he braked a little bit late. And it damaged and it's 30 grand for a front box, for a front wing assembly and a nose box, 30 grand. And you think that really wasn't a £30,000 mistake. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So you do have to box clever, so to speak, and really think of, certainly if you're piecing budget together weekend by weekend, there are ways of being clever about it, and it does play on the mind of some drivers. But when I got to sports cars, we actually picked so when I said we won the first race against Bruni and Fisichella, the most amazing part of that story was that the JMW team, so Jim and myself and Rob, we travelled down and picked the car up in Italy on the way to Paul Ricard. So we went to Italy, picked the car up, and then drove to Paul Ricard for the first race. So I think we shook it down, I want to say Adria, somewhere like that, for literally an hour, stick it in the truck, send it, we'll go to race 1, and we won it. And that was my first experience of basically, even though I was bringing a bit of money to get my foot in the door, that car was owned by the team boss, and I think it was 5 grand short of £500,000, that car. So when you're in a car suddenly that costs that amount of money, and you're against Fisichella, who's fucking doing this to you down the straight, and you're just like, this is ridiculous. And then, but the funny thing was with Jim, why he's still going at it today is, he's so precious about his car because it's a beautiful, beautiful piece of machinery. But if you ever didn't go for a move or you didn't go for something in case you made contact, he'd be the first person to say, oh, well, you should have just sent one, made contact with him and worried about it later. So it's a strange one, the cost of the sport.
Perfect.
But it is one of those things that you just have to kind of disconnect your brain a bit and forget about it, because it, like anything, if you actually thought about the cost and the what ifs, you wouldn't do it. You wouldn't do it.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we're going more into Formula 1. We talked about this last time when we spoke to you as well, with the cost of the parts of the cars now. It's obviously technology and everything's just a joke. But one thing that stuck in my mind, I can't forget it, is when you said how many engines you go through in different types of sports, the parts you use.
Yeah, so it's crazy. So what can we use an example? So something like Formula 3, again, this is when I did it, so this would have been 10 years ago, you'd probably have 2 engine rebuilds maybe during the year. I don't, something like that, maybe. Obviously, now in Formula One, we've got the situation where they're limited to number of engines a year. But I had a senior engineer of mine in LMP2, actually, in the World Endurance Championship, who was an ex-Toyota Formula One engineer. When Toyota first came into Formula One, I think it was in their first year, actually, when they had, I want to say, McNish and Sarlo, I think, when they first came into Formula One. And they would have also have had test teams, probably 2 test teams and a race team at any one time, going all over the world to different places to do different things. And he told me they did 163 engines in a year.
Yeah, I can't believe that.
Not 63.
To me. I can't believe
so. With 2 cars and a test team, you're doing over 150 engines a year. And I've done some research, and in the day when they've got test teams and they've got unlimited budget, and you've got teams like Honda, Mercedes, Ferrari that want to win at any cost, when there was testing, there was no such thing as a testing ban, and you could be in a car, you could have a car running somewhere every day. It gets to a point, you see the power start to drop off, stick a new engine in it. We're going to do a set day of practice starts, stick a new engine in it. In those days you had quali engines, you had qualifying engines that were literally designed to do an out lap, a quick lap, and an in lap. That was it. You had qualifying gearboxes that you could literally probably stick a fork through them that had been that thin and lightweight. And everything was just designed to the nth degree that's just how it was. And because your competition was doing it, it meant you had to do it as well. And it just shows when the manufacturers like Toyota, these global manufacturers like Toyota, if they were going to do something, they would do it properly. It's as simple as that. Because when you think about the cost of Formula One, especially, and it's the same for all motorsport actually, so Formula One, World Rally Championship, MotoGP, things like that, where manufacturers have to put their brand, their stamp of approval, it's signed off at board level. It's not just some bloke in an office saying, oh, well, let's give it a go, see what happens. These are serious financial decisions with shareholders and everything. And you can't do anything half-assed. If you're going to do it, you've got to do it properly. So I think that when they say, teams are still spending huge amounts of money and it's out of control, it's really not as out of control as it used to be. However, the budget cap now is still needed purely because they're thinking, okay, well, how do we grow this sport? How do we get back to this? I think the last 2 Grand Prix, the coverage I've seen, they've talked about this idea, that back in the day, they used to be pre-qualifying. So you'd have 1 or 2 car teams coming to try to qualify. And, they might make up, pre-qualifying might make up the last 4 places of the main qualifying, but you'd have another 10 teams trying to qualify on a Saturday, which would be amazing. But to get to that point, you've got to basically have cars that, in a similar way to Formula 2, all the cars are the same. You can go down to Dallara, you can buy yourself a Formula 2 car for 100 grand. You can employ a load of people, you can try and qualify. And it needs to have that model, but you're not going to get that model spending 300, 400 million quid. When you think about sports cars, I keep coming back to sports cars and Le Mans and the manufacturer model of Le Mans, it does work. I wouldn't want to guess what the top manufacturers spend at Le Mans, but I'd imagine when Audi and Porsche were trying to win Le Mans, they're probably spending, again, don't kill me for getting it wrong, I'd imagine they're spending somewhere between 50 to 60, 70 million, something like that. I'd guess. But that needs to be the stage where actually, it's crazy when you even say the words only 50 million quid. But if you're going to try and piece together with financial backing and private investment, etc., there needs to be a model where you can buy basically an off-the-shelf Formula One car, which they've had a number of occasions where teams were prepared to sell year-old cars to teams, but the Concord Agreement and the teams say, no, not doing that. So they've got to want to grow it. And I think that's the hurdle that Liberty Media have got, is they need to get team bosses that actually, even if they don't benefit from it, because it'll be a split of prize money or it'll be a different sport. They have to get the okay from the teams that are currently on board. And I think that once they get over that hurdle, then we'll see a sport that probably does change quite dramatically, I think.
So with Formula One, then, what's the turn-off for teams like Audi and Toyota and teams like that who are so successful in motor racing to not come into Formula One? Because they're not there now. It's obviously difficult to get.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's. Yeah, go for it.
I mean, before you answer that, because I had a partly due to that question actually, which you might be familiar with, is the fact that this new LMH and LMDH series that's come into sports car, or WEC, loads of manufacturers seem to be uptaking that. We've got Ferrari, Cadillac, Acura, all the US names. We've got loads of an influx of manufacturers moving to that sport now. So I wondered that might maybe slightly kind of fit in with that question, because I thought that was an interesting kind of thing that I've noticed recently, that they've all of a sudden started to take up this new series.
Yeah, it's a strange one actually, because there was a period in time, it was probably just prior to the financial crisis back in kind of 07, 08, 09, where sports cars and Formula One were always the complete opposite of each other. So as you saw manufacturers leaving Formula One, manufacturers would go into sports car racing. And at the same way, it would work the other way around. If one's up, the other's down. Whereas at the moment, we've got, in a good way, which surprises me, bearing in mind we've just been through a 2-year pandemic and people losing jobs and the economy's doing all sorts of different things. Manufacturers are actually now putting the money where their mouth is and committing to larger projects. And I think that when you, in answer to the question, what's preventing Audi and Porsche, I think that now that Formula One has gone to that stage of being so technical from a car perspective, and the knowledge and experience that those teams that are currently competing have now had with the hybrid cars and the batteries and the electrics and all of that stuff, if you're going to come in now, you're effectively, bearing in mind the development time of before the hybrid car started, you're effectively a decade behind the competition. So then you say, okay, well, we can't, as I said before, the money involved, decisions at board level, shareholders, brand strength, all of this stuff added up. Are you honestly going to commit to something with a massive spend, which will take away spend from other parts of your programs, whether it'll be... So I remember, for example, when BMW were in Formula One with Williams and then Sauber, the minute they came out of Formula One, their World Touring Car and World Superbike program had loads of budget. So they have money. It's just a case of, well, how do we cleverly spend it over 12 months?
Allocate it, yeah.
So I think Audi and Porsche and any other manufacturers will think about, okay, well, this is the pot of money we have. Are we actually sat here at a board meeting, 2 years ahead of when we'd actually do it, telling ourselves that Formula One is the very best way to spend that money? And there'll be people sat around those tables that probably say, no, it's not. And when you compare that investment to sports cars for a 20th of the spend, and with more flexibility, still a lot of technology, but probably more manageable, smaller teams, smaller investment, smaller premises. They're not employing 1,000 people; they're probably employing 100. All of these things now do play, sadly, a part in a decision. And I think that, again, you guys will know more about it than I do, but did I hear that actually Porsche are probably going to come in as the brand of the Red Bull engine or something similar like that?
Yeah, so the news this week has been that, Porsche and Red Bull seem to be a little bit up in the air, but it seems like Audi are trying to put a bid in to purchase Sauber, and so Alfa Romeo would kind of leave their tenure as the title sponsor, because I don't think, from what I've read, Alfa Romeo contribute any technicality to the car.
Right.
Any technical know-how. It's purely designed and run by Sauber, and Alfa Romeo primarily just the sponsor. So I think Audi are looking at erodes in that way. But I think it's interesting with what you were saying about, in terms of where's best to spend their money. I think that this huge, influx of new fans that we've gained from things like the Netflix show, and Formula One is growing massive. I mean, you mentioned it last we spoke when you were at Silverstone of the energy that was there in comparison to previous years. Maybe manufacturers are now, because of these, you've got Audi and Porsche looking at introduce themselves into the grid, that maybe they are looking at it now as being the best place to spend the money because there's so many eyes on the sport. I mean, even with just myself, friends and family that I've never been into F1, but all of a sudden since this Netflix series came to a head, that they're starting to watch it and enjoy it.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, as I said, everything always works in cycles within motorsport, and it's. I think you're right with the way the perception of, when we're talking about a manufacturer. So let's not forget that a manufacturer's primary objective is to sell road cars. That's it. Yeah. And I think that when Formula One was in that period of, well, the manufacturer was just a tiny little logo that you didn't really see on the side of a racing car. That didn't really do the brand, unless you're winning. Caveat to this conversation. Unless you're winning and you're winning world champions, and it says Ferrari world champion, it didn't really have the impact that a lot of the manufacturers wanted to get back for their money. Whereas I think now with the global coverage, the accessibility, the fan base, the number of races, the regions that they now travel to, the demographic has changed massively. So again, I think back to when I started racing, which was pre-social media, and you looked at the people that would come and watch, they were basically hardy race fans that had been sat on banks with programs for 25 years. They knew who you are, they knew the backstory, they knew the teams, they knew the chassis, they knew the car set, all, and they were in a positive way geeky about the sport. They were knowledgeable and they got it. Whereas actually the fan now, again, in a good way, is more about the spectacle and the atmosphere and the experience. The experience of a sporting event now, and how it's televised, how it's captured, how it's shared, how it's filmed individually. If you think that all of these people are capturing their own versions of all of these experiences themselves and sharing them themselves and creating this hype themselves, that didn't happen 10 years ago. That was basically down to, if you think about it in a smaller way, British touring cars, for example, that was on grandstand on a Sunday afternoon for 2 hours, and that was it. No one videoed it, no one shared it, no one tweeted about it, no one put Instagram. And now those drivers and the manufacturers that get involved and the sponsors have got this massive pool of accessibility. And I think that's going back to what you've said. That's basically now manufacturers that dismissed Formula One 10, 15, 20 years ago. It's now back on the boardroom table because it's now a marketing, without sounding boring, it's now a marketing process. It's a brand awareness. It's a, how do we change the demographic that we're trying to access? Porsche, for example, with whether it's their electric program, whether it's the different design of road cars, whether it's they're thinking actually we're seeing our demographic is now, our price of our cars are getting out of reach, so our demographics going higher, not lower. How do we actually bring that down? How do we access a younger brand or a younger part of the market? Well, maybe Formula One for them ticks that box. So they all have different objectives, but ultimately, if you're going to go and spend, I don't know what the new budget cap is, 150 million, something like that. If you're going to go and spend 100 whatever it is, if you're going to go and spend that money every year, 12 months later, you have to sit back at that boardroom table and tell the people that said that you shouldn't spend it that it was a good spend and we need more and we need to go and do it again. And I think it's a hard sell for some. You've got some manufacturers like Audi and Porsche and Mercedes that have just got the history that they don't really need to sell the concept of having a racing team. Whereas you have some manufacturers where actually racing's probably not as high on the agenda as other stuff is. So I mean, hopefully they do, because again, everything we've seen from Audi and Porsche in sports cars is just done beautifully, and it's just done to an epic level. And I think when you've got two manufacturers like that mixing it with the Ferraris of this world and the Red Bulls of this world and Mercedes, it'll be an epic spectacle to watch.
Speaking of spectacles, I mean, something that's come out in the news this week. I know it caused a stir at Silverstone with Sebastian Vettel driving around in the old Williams on sustainable fuels. And so the conversation has kind of arisen as to, can they bring back V10s provided they run on these sustainable fuels?
Yes, I mean, please do.
Yeah.
Well,
I hope so.
It's funny. It's the noise thing, as I'm sure most F1 fans, it's crazy. So I remember going to Silverstone for the first. So I've been, I think, every year since 2003, I think. And I remember being there for the first year of the hybrid era. I remember standing with some guests in the BRDC suite, and I had my back to the track. So I think I was stood, I don't know, at a bar or talking to someone. And, the windows are thin glass windows, balcony doors type thing, nothing special. And I was stood talking to someone with my back to the track. And I turned around and realized that the session had started 20 minutes ago. And my heart literally just went,
shouldn't be that way.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, I can't believe it. And if you flip that the other way around, when you were at a track with V10s, even the V8s, your ears would be ringing still on Wednesday after the race. You still couldn't hear people. And now I take people that have never. So, for example, this year at the Grand Prix, I had 8 guests there, and gave them. Some of them had never been to a Grand Prix before, and it's an amazing. I'm hugely privileged to be able to share that with people. But I do feel a tinge of sadness every time I take someone that's only ever heard the hybrid era, and you explain to someone that, okay, so that thing you can hear that you're quite impressed with, it used to literally be 50 times louder than that. And they just think that's not possible. And then when you get a display like that, whereas I think at Silverstone you had that car, and I think you had an old Benetton, and I think there was, I think Zach Brown was driving something at some stage as well that had a V10 or a V12 in it. And you see these people's faces that have never heard these cars before, and they're just like, their eyes light up. So I love the fact that I'm all for being responsible and thinking of the future and the planet and all that stuff. Don't get me wrong, but there needs to be an element of putting on a show and putting on a spectacle, and we have to find different ways of offsetting what we do on the track, of course. And there's very clever ways of doing that. But I think what we are in danger of is being led by society, or led by the TV viewer, so to speak. And I don't mean that disrespectfully. I think the sport needs to be strong enough, as football is, as golf is, other sports that are global sports. I think we said before, with DRS, with different cars, with different this, every year we have a different something. In a football match, if there's loads of 0-0 draws every year, they don't change the rules of football. They don't put another ball on the pitch or make the goal bigger or have a few less people. It is what it is, and you have to work around it. And I've always been a fan of. We've talked about our hate for DRS, but I've always been a fan of those races. You think of Imola with Schumacher and Alonso. At no stage did either of them pass each other, but it was the best race I've ever seen. Because he nearly passed him. He nearly had a look. He nearly outbraked himself. And I think we need to get back to that, not listening to every opinion of how to make the racing better. Because the reality is, if you put all of those Formula 1 drivers in Formula 2 cars that were all exactly the same, the racing would be epic.
Yeah.
So,
if the sound came back, I'd forget about everything.
And I think that I'd rather see a car that was
about it.
sounding like a V10 or a V12, but was lapping 5 seconds slower or 10 seconds slower. You wouldn't know. It's mad.
I think we should say if you were at a track and you can order a
Very
drink,
wrong,
something's
yeah.
wrong because they
Yeah.
can hear you
And
ordering your drink.
And I
So
think,
you
yeah,
should be
exactly.
there.
But the thing you've got to think
to put it
of
in
is that
perspective,
I've again been lucky enough to go to a MotoGP race a couple of times, and I went to that with no
Yeah.
prior knowledge of what to expect at all, and I was blown away by
Yeah.
it. And I say that in a way of
Yeah.
being in awe of the riders, not understanding how that was physically possible. And I remember standing there, and it was on a Friday at the end of free practice 1. And as the riders came into what was the old pit lane at Silverstone, up near Copse, and they were waving to the crowd, sat on the side of the bike and waving and stuff. But the crowd were applauding that they'd not killed themselves for 45 minutes, basically. Like, those bikes are just absolute monsters. And you can see it, the bike's leant over at 45 degrees, and you can hear the TC trying to kick them off the top of it. And they're riding there with one hand and in the wet. And it's just, you can't believe what you're watching. Whereas I think now, certainly on television, I think the cars have got to that point because certainly with the lack of noise and the lack of movement in the cars, that it's not until you see a car up close that you think, oh shit, that's impressive. And I think TV, which is where the majority, 99% of Formula One fans will watch it on TV, not live at a track. I think they've got to make it so that the cars are more challenging to drive, difficult to drive. And I've always said from experience through Super League and World Series and Formula 3, take the power steering off. It solves 99% of your problems.
Yeah,
you can do DRS, you can do this, bigger front wings.
Yeah.
If you take power steering away, back to how it used to be, drivers will make mistakes. And it's those mistakes that give people an opportunity to pass or get a run on them or get a better exit. And that's where the racing is side by side, because the cars are physical.
Yeah.
Do you think if that happened, do you reckon Yuki Tsunoda would be totally screwed because he's so small and he probably wouldn't be able to handle the car like that?
Yeah.
I mean, he'd be done. Even Lando is probably a bit small to handle.
The funny thing, but again, the way the
but
human body is, the natural talent would figure out a way. You would train.
Yeah, absolutely.
To suit the objective. So if you've got to look back to, Senna was a classic example. If you see those videos of him training, and he was of his time, the fittest driver, so to speak. But he wasn't built like a Mansell or a Warwick or a any of that lot. He had inner core, just natural strength because he worked hard at it. And I'm lucky enough to, Derek Warwick, ex Formula One driver, obviously lives in Jersey, and I know him well. And Nigel Mansell's also a resident in Jersey, so I see him every now and again driving around. And you see these guys from the 80s and 90s. They're big guys. They're strong guys, but it's because they had to be. They had to muscle these cars around. And I think I could be completely wrong with this, but when you watch an IndyCar race, certainly on a street course, when you see these cars moving around, and they're a good, what are they, 10, 12, 15 seconds slower than a Formula 1 car on around a lap, something like that.
Yeah.
But you can't tell. You still watch an IndyCar around Detroit or Long Beach, and you think, oh my god, there's no way I could do that. And that's why fans love it. And it's the same with NASCAR. NASCAR's got less driver aids on it than anything that's ever been built. It hasn't even got a fuel gauge on it. But these guys muscle these cars around.
Because with NASCAR, now that it's become in NASCAR, I don't know if you know so much about it, but now that it's becoming more of a track that's not circular, it's not just the circle. You've gotten onto more of a street area. The drivers that are younger and fitter and not so built like a Mansell are quicker on the tracks where there's more corners. But then you've got these bigger lads who are much better in the circular race. So it's quite interesting to see how that would change the sport in that respect. Because even now in NASCAR, there's still some really wide set people that do drive these cars better than what.
But I think it's like anything.
So it does change.
You deal with whatever you deal with whatever's given to you. But I think certainly if it was purely focused on how do we make the race, the side-by-side racing, you've got to make the cars difficult to drive. It's as simple as that. When you've got these cars where you can dial up the power steering,
no power steering,
and you can literally, fingertip stuff. Obviously, the corner. Don't get me wrong, the corners are quick. The G is huge. The brake forces are incredible, like beyond belief. But
I mean, we saw
it's got to
Charles
be
Leclerc
challenging.
at Suzuka a few years back go around the corner one-handed whilst he was holding on to the wing mirror. You know, that shouldn't be possible at 170 miles an hour.
It shouldn't. It simply shouldn't be possible. You know? And when you started seeing, my Formula One history is coming out now. So was it 2011 and 12 where they had the F duct? You remember the F duct in Formula One, where they basically had a hole in the side of the tub which they held their hand against to block the air to the rear wing. And when they were going through Eau Rouge one-handed, I was like, nah, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's where Formula One's gone too far.
So yeah, I think they need to give some things.
I still can't do Eau Rouge on the game. Like, Eau Rouge is a most ridiculous corner I've ever seen. Honestly, any racing game, if any sim that I've done, I've not once managed to get up Eau Rouge in a clean way, unless I'm in like 4 gears.
It's funny. Spa, as I said, is one of my favourite tracks, and one of the reasons for that is the first time I ever went was in Formula 3, actually. And where if anyone that's ever been there, when you arrive at the paddock, you basically drive through these forests and you kind of don't really know where you are. And then you drive into this field and you drive towards the downhill part, and you literally are queuing up to get in the gate, and you look up left and you just see Eau Rouge going up and over the hill. And you just think, oh my God. And I remember the first time in World Series, actually, that I drove through, and it's flat in World Series quite easily once you get used to it. But the feeling of how much the cars ground out and bottom out through the compression of Eau Rouge is just incredible. Like the energy that's in the car. The energy that's in the cars, sports cars, Formula 1, F2, or whatever. The energy that you feel going through corners like Eau Rouge is incredible. And it always amazes me. I mean, it was actually flat in the GT car, in the GT2 car. But that's when you realise how well built the thing you're sat in is, because you think, God, you do that every lap.
Yeah.
And again, that was the same at Le Mans and 6 hour, 12 hours, 24-hour races with the GT cars. It's, you think every lap's a qualifying lap. Le Mans, sometimes I think the quickest lap in the race is quicker than qualifying. Every lap is a qualifying lap, and you can't believe that these cars.
I've never seen.
Anyone listening.
I mean, how high actually is it?
The crazy thing is, what you don't really appreciate is that the run down to it's incredibly steep. Plus the hill's steep, so it's not like you're doing that. It's like you're doing that. So the car accelerates. The car accelerates incredibly quickly down from the source down the hill, and then it's quite a surreal one because it's so steep that you can actually, and you're coming from so high up, you can actually see the top of it when you start, and then the top of it disappears because you go so low below it. But the trick is, especially in the wet, you've just got to be ultra smooth. If you go to Spa and try and be aggressive, you're slow as Christmas. It just doesn't work. You've really got to have a car that you can just is pointy, but you're not waiting. You don't want a car that's oversteery all the time because you need confidence. But if you have any understeer in the car, so if you have a car that turns in and just doesn't turn, because all of the corners are quite long radius corners, so you're actually, especially in the middle sector, you're in the corners for quite a long time. So any period where you're having to wait for the front is magnified 4 or 5 times. So a car, a good setup car is like Barcelona. Spa is a good example of it. But yeah, with Eau Rouge, it's one of those things that you can build up to doing it flat, and you think, oh God, this is not possible. And then the minute you do it flat for the first time, you're like, oh, what was all the worry about? And I remember it's obviously easily flat in Formula 3 because the cars actually relatively aren't that quick. But in World Series, I remember I always used to have an engineer that I'd say, look, as I'm out on track in practice, just give me 3 sector times. So just give me, minus a tenth, minus 2 tenths, minus 3 tenths. So I'll know where I'm losing the most time. And basically sector 1 at Spa is basically braking full of source and Eau Rouge. That's it. It's 2 corners, and then the sector ends at the top of the hill. And I remember him telling me that I was quite a way off in the first sector. And I remember saying on the radio, I'm assuming everyone's flat in Eau Rouge, because we were in the downhill pit lane, so he could hear everyone whether they were flat up the hill. And he just came back saying, yeah, They are. Everyone's flat. I was like, well, I'm just going to have to do it. And the trick is with Eau Rouge is that your brain doesn't, your body and your brain don't match. So when you're driving and when you arrive at the bottom of Eau Rouge doing 170, 80-ish, the point in which your brain just goes, nah, is a lot earlier than you'd think, actually. It's quite high up the hill. So I found the only trick to do it, because we had limited number of laps, limited fuel. I was wanting to do it flat, but I'd get into the base of the hill and my foot would just jump off the pedal. Like my brain's saying, this is the lap, but my foot would just naturally come off the pedal. So the only way I could quickly figure out a way of doing it was because you have to left foot brake, so you've got hand clutches, you don't have a clutch by your feet, is that I'd accelerate out of the source and then I put my left foot on top of my right foot and pushed with my left foot as hard as I could. Just as hard as I could. And I could feel my right foot underneath my left foot trying to get off the throttle, and I just kept on pushing with my left foot. And then once you do it the first lap, then of course, like everything, it's easy. It's easy every lap after that. You think, oh, what was all the panic about? But you've got to disconnect your brain quite a few occasions and just trust, especially when you've got downforce, because that was a whole other trick. You know, learning to drive a car with downforce because it's invisible is quite a trick in itself.
That's what I was going to ask. I mean, I think for most like ordinary people getting into a high downforce car, that's where their brain's going, that's not going to work, that's not going to work, we're just going to go into the sky. But it doesn't work like that.
It's strange. I remember having to get my head around it, but basically the trick to being quick in a high downforce car is, so if you take, for example, Stowe at Silverstone, so you've got a long straight, you arrive at terminal velocity. You know, it's a very light brake. It's probably down 2 gears. Minimum speed's probably 130, something like that. Or cops, you know, they're now flat in cops. You've basically, if there's a corner where you have to brake and downshift, but you've got to use downforce, you basically just have to teach yourself to just get off the brake pedal. It's so easy to brake and over brake and kill the speed. And once you kill the speed, then you've lost the downforce. And because you've lost the downforce, you have to go slower. Because you've gone slower, you lose more downforce, so it spirals out of control. And the only way to do it is literally just the minute you brake, just get off the brake and roll speed in, and then you think, oh, that felt all right actually, and then you can start to gather confidence. But the problem is, if you don't commit to the entry, then you've lost the corner completely. But it always, it's funny when you can ever do. So if I've done passenger rides with, driving a car around Silverstone or whatever, and you've got people in the passenger seat, and if you ever drive anything like a Radical or a small sports car or anything like that that's got a bit of grip and a bit of a rear wing and a bit of a front wing, it's such a surprise to people that it'll just go and it'll stick and it'll do what you ask it to do. But when you go and stand and watch Formula One, so for example, this year this is obviously the first time I'd seen the new generation of cars, which I thought were really impressive. But I took some people around the outside of Copse down to Maggots and Beckett's and stood on the outside of there, which if anyone goes to Silverstone, that's where you've got to go. At least one session, go and stand on the outside of Copse and Maggots and Beckett's. And, 10 years ago, I remember that in Maggots and Beckett's, they'd be flat through the left, flat through the right, and then it'd be a big brake and a downshift for the middle left. They're now flat easily through the left. It's not even the car doesn't even see it. And that's where you really see downforce. And you just have to stand there and watch people that are either have never seen it before or haven't been lucky enough to drive. And the reaction on their face is just like, holy shit. Like, how is that? You don't see it. And that's the only thing that makes me angry. Yeah, that's the only thing that makes me angry with TV is that if you think how good the coverage and how good everything is,
you'll never get it.
There's still, I don't know who decides, but there's still, they don't put the cameras in the right place to see the cars really doing what they're doing. I think onboard cameras now have got very good, but somewhere like Copse, for example, at Silverstone, if you stand on the outside of Copse, so they're coming from right and away from you, they always show a car coming towards the camera. So you have no sense of speed or anything like that. And it's always a close-in shot of the car. But if you put a camera on the outside looking at where the car's going, just a static camera, it's mind-boggling. It really is mind-boggling.
there's some examples I've seen in Albert Park. I think is it
Yeah.
turn 8 or 9? That's
The
chicane.
S chicane. Yeah.
There's a static camera there, and so they compare it to like even GT cars going around it, and then they compare it to a Formula One car. And it's mind-boggling.
Yeah.
You just don't.
Melbourne as well. With
that's what we're talking about.
that
Albert
small
Park,
chicane in Melbourne when you see the full speed on that.
But it's funny.
Sorry,
the one
I'm stupid.
example of that, I talked about Warwick and Mansell actually. Before I remember, and I randomly saw it. I started watching it again yesterday. There's a really fascinating documentary about Mansell in '93 when he went and did IndyCar or Champ Car, I think it was called. And I believe that Mansell was testing at one of the super speedways, so the really, really quick ovals, the 240 mile an hour jobs. And I think it was someone like, I think it was an ex-Formula One driver that he'd raced with, or I want to say it's someone like Derek or Mark Blundell or someone of that era came to watch him test, or was in America or was in the US at the same time, so came along to the race and watched. And he was stood in the pit lane and he was watching it go by and he was like, oh, that looks quick. And Nigel just said, tell you what, go to the outside into the grandstand, walk down to the entry to turn 1, walk down to the fence, and there's a little, like a photographer's gap in the fence. He said, do us a favour, go down there and just stick your head through that gap. And he wandered down there for the next session and stuck his head through the gap. And apparently, even an ex-Formula One driver from the 90s just took one look at that of one car going past and was just like, no thanks, not for me. Because just the raw speed and how you actually view the cars as they're meant to be seen is just incredible.
Yeah, I've got a friend that went to Indy 500 and he stood in a similar section of the track like that. He said loads of people on the first lap will go and stand there because you can actually feel it. And he said when the first cars go past, the video's hilarious because he's there on himself at one point where there's loads of cars coming off the restart. And it sends him to the ground. He fell over because of the power of the cars coming towards the air coming off them.
Yeah, it is incredible.
To the floor. And that's the things you don't see on camera. I mean, I've been to the tracks. I went to Abu Dhabi and the slingshot of the cars coming off that first straight, it's just a joke. You don't see that on TV whatsoever. So you have to go and experience it to really feel the sport and have that connection. I think it changes your life.
Yeah. Well, one last thing I thought to go through is what would your prediction be for championship winner this year in Formula One?
Oh man, I think
this has to be right because you're an ex-racing driver.
This does have to be right. There's pressure on here. I do think Max, now that he's won a championship before and that the team have won a championship, I think they're better prepared now than they have been for a significant amount. If you think back to when Vettel was winning multiple championships, they just had that aura about them over, from Thursday, from Friday through to Sunday. And I think now Max has visibly changed his approach. If you think of the Max at the same time last year was a bit erratic and I think they've cleverly, not that he needed teaching much, but I think they've very cleverly realised that if you just get rid of those aggressive mistakes and going for a move when it's not quite on instead of picking up a second or a third. If you look now, he is a more mature, even 12 months on, he is more mature than he was a year ago. So I think through car performance, driver performance, and picking up points on his off days, I think that's now enough for Max to win the championship. I would love to see Ferrari win it. I think they've had so many years of nearly but not nearly, and then years where the car's just been crap and they've just been slagged off, and what's happened to the old Ferrari and they're useless, and people are getting think how many team managers they've been through in the last 10 years. For them to actually have said, we've written off last year's car, we're concentrating on the new generation and it working, will be brilliant for the sport to have Ferrari winning a championship again. I think Leclerc in qualifying, from Silverstone alone, when you stand on the outside of, so I was on the outside of Brooklands into the complex, Max, Leclerc and Sainz looked visually quicker, which is actually harder than it sounds because they all look quick. But when you literally watch Max and Leclerc, especially, come into Brooklands, you stand back and you think there's no way that's stopping, and it does. And I think when they visually look on another level, it's clear to see why every weekend it's the two of them. I think if Mercedes is a factor in this championship because they're not going to win the championship, I don't think. Obviously, a long way to go. Anything's possible. But they will start winning races. So the issue for Max and Leclerc will be when they don't win, where do they finish? Where are they finishing? Because there could be a point where if that Merc's sorted out and both George and Lewis are at the front, you may find on a good day they're fighting for third. And actually, that's going to really test the mentality of the two of them, is that you've just got to go through. If you want to win a championship, it's not won on the last day of the championship. It's actually won. The points you get in November are just as important as the ones you get in March or February, April, May, June. So I think now that we've got a more mature Max, I think I'm probably going to put my money on Max, I think.
Yeah, well, now's an interesting time to think about that as well, with Mercedes improving so much. I mean, at the time of recording this, we're going into a race weekend in France. So that's a very similar track to Silverstone in a way. So you'd think Mercedes have a pretty decent chance going into this. And if they can get some progress going where they are winning races or challenging, then George does have a slim chance of getting to the top.
I think George will win a race this year. I think that he's done everything you'd expect of him and more, if I'm honest. He's played it perfectly. He's almost let the first half of the year, the focus has been on Lewis's struggle, and he's just been picking up points, picking up results. Probably internally, he's probably in a better position with the team and the engineers, and the feel and vibe of his side of the garage is probably better than Lewis's, I think. And I think in the long term, that's going to pay dividends, I think. And I think that having stood and experienced how he can manage a year, admittedly it was Formula Forward, but I've watched a very young George Russell win a championship firsthand, and he knows how to go about weekend after weekend, just plugging away, getting the results, getting the points. And we've seen that at Williams. And I think if you put him in a car that can win races, you'll be surprised how quickly he'll be winning championships.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that, definitely.
Yeah,
he's definitely a star for the present and the future, I think, really. Well, thank you very much. I mean, do you want to mention anything about your company? I know that you do race experiences. If you want to tell the listenership.
So off the back of obviously everything I've done previously, now we're in a position now where I'm very passionate about bringing that experience to people that have not experienced it before. Effectively buying the money can't buy experience. So the company is called React Experiences. So there's a hospitality side to the business, but also a corporate driving coaching side to the business. And now that obviously we're coming out the back of the pandemic and everything, the world's getting back to normal. There are cases of, if there are people that were in my situation and not knowing how to start racing, not knowing anyone to talk to, needing advice, they can always contact me. I mean, like speaking to you guys, I'm so passionate about the sport. I'm always happy to help anyone achieve anything. So I think there'll be various ways of finding me and contacting me, but by all means, feel free to get in touch.
Yeah, we can vouch for that. Extremely approachable.
You won't get rid of me now. That's the problem. You won't get rid of me now.
we could.
Well, I think a good question then. Can we come and try a simulator somewhere? Do you know anywhere we can try a simulator?
Yeah, so
I want to go for.
I mean, again, not meaning to plug anyone over anyone else, but Darren Turner, factory Aston Martin driver, runs Base Performance down near Brackley, and Darren is as experienced and as knowledgeable and as quick as probably any driver that's ever put a helmet on his head. So he's got a fantastic facility down there, Base Performance. And if there's anyone ever wanting to do, whether it's corporate events or private events, parties, you and your mates to split the cost, Base Performance is a fantastic facility. They've got GT simulators, Formula One simulators, full data engineer. You literally feel like a racing driver for the day. You've got everything you need. And it is a really good insight into what technically drivers need to experience. And then if you are ever going to go and do a track day, for example, in all seriousness, going to somewhere like that where you can have the same car, same track, just give yourself a bit of a head start, because that's something that some people sadly again get their fingers burned. If they are going to go and do a track day for the first time and be on a Grand Prix circuit, it's very easy to overdrive and make a mistake, and your day is finished before it's even started. So do a little bit of prep, do some homework, watch the onboard stuff. But if you do have a chance with simulators, then obviously go and give it a go.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for your time, James.
Pleasure. Anytime.
Amazing hearing the stories. It's it's something that we obviously haven't got any experience in, so it's fascinating. I mean, we could sit here and listen to you for hours and hours and hours. So I'm sure we'd definitely love to have you on again at some point in the future, because, like I said, it's just invaluable information that we know nothing about. We're mere mortals in racing world. So thank
pleasure.
you.
Anytime.
For spending time.
Brilliant. Right. See you soon, guys. Cheers.